Hello, listeners of the Gamers Kingdom. Today we have a very special episode. We have with us Dr. Tom Rudolf, history teacher at Berkeley, and we are going to talk today about Final Fantasy VI and the operas, how opera impacted this video game and music in general. So, welcome, Dr. Tom. Tom, thanks for joining me tonight on this interview. I'm very, very happy to have you here, bringing your experience on music history around the 80s. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Emmy, thanks for the invitation here. It's you and I have been working together in the Berkeley online courses in music history, and my background in music history goes back to my master's degree, where I got a bachelor's degree in performance and music education from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and I got a master's in music history from Westchester University, and that's where my love of history came about. I turned 70 this year. I've been teaching music history everywhere from the high school to the college and online for 40-some years. So I'm thrilled to be here.
That's awesome. So the purpose of this interview, what triggered it is, like, together we have been discussing across the last weeks with the influence of opera in general in music. We learned a lot about it. And then it came to my mind, like, hey, I know an opera from a game, a video game, Final Fantasy VI. And I was curious exactly what of the opera of the old ages, let's say of the classical period, were the ones that influenced this game. So just to bring a bit of context on the video game itself, right? It's Final Fantasy VI was released in the early 90s. Nobuo Uematsu, the composer, decided that as part of the game, you would have an opera. The opera touches like typical concepts of these dramatic stories we would have. In this case, it's a kind of love triangle, kind of. It's the war between the West and the East, and the princess of the East gets captured. And then she's called Maria, right? And Draco, a warrior from the East, still loves her and goes to the rescue. Then you have Ralph, that is the kind of prince of the West that has to marry her just to kind of finish conquering the Earth. And in the middle of this drama, we have this orchestral composition. The original piece of music actually was divided in 4 sections in the original game in Super Nintendo. So it's kind of an amazing feat that in this very old console, they tried to replicate kind of an opera. It was kind of the first early attempts. And in this very 4-part opera, we have an overture, which acts as introduction, an aria, wedding waltz, and the grand finale. But here we are already touching some key concepts of the opera itself, right? For example, I mentioned an aria. What's an aria? We hear aria in general in classical music, but what is an aria, Tom?
Aria is a word that's used typically to when a solo singer sings a piece in an opera. That's what aria. Aria means song, and that's all that means. Typically, when we say we're listening to an aria, it's one of the major characters singing and giving in their thoughts, and we learn the story. The other term that in opera is duet, where 2 characters sing together back and forth. And then the other style is a chorus number, where a whole group of singers sing. And in this opera, the grand finale has multiple people singing. And that would be you would label that chorus singing. If it's any more than 2, they typically call it a chorus.
The interesting part here is the aria is called, I think Final Fantasy fans will recognize it as Aria di mezzo carattere. That's mezzo carattere, it's Italian for half character. So it's like the song of half a character. In this case, Maria, which is this single soloist, also the female voice on this aria, brings one of the most memorable renditions in these games, in these Final Fantasies, right? So the composer Nobuo Uematsu clearly, one of the great things of composing for video games is that you can actually draft your own world. If you would be recording a movie, maybe you need to stick to that age or that moment. But in this game, we have an opera piece. We have like more march military music. We have more rock modern music. We even have like kind of a rock and roll done on kind of retro style called Johnny C. Bad instead of Johnny Be Good. It's kind of interesting. But what did Uematsu think? That's a key discussion here. What influences do you think he had to compose this piece?
Well, the first thing that came to mind when I went to a website to look up and read about the story, of course, when we think of opera, we think of these love triangles, and often ending with one of the members dying at the end, the tragic opera. And here in the U.S., we have what they call soap operas, which are TV shows that became popular in the 50s when women were mostly home taking care of the house, and the commercials were about soap. So that's why I called them soap opera. But they had no singing. It was just it was a dramatic TV show, but it was about this kind of intrigue between typically a couple or two couples. But if you ask me about what were the influences, well, the first opera that comes to mind is Tristan and Isolde by Wagner. It was one of Wagner's first operas that used the leitmotif style, where leitmotifs, as you know, Emmy, is a short melodic sequence that represents a character or a thing. And Tristan and Isolde that's set in the 6th century, but it has very much the same relationship, where it revolves around love and sacrifice and the backdrop of political conflict. So, so that was the first one. And you had mentioned some of these in your notes, and you were right on. The next is La Traviata by Verdi. Giuseppe Verdi, his operas often have this. The names are similar. You have Maria and Draco. Is that, they're saying those names correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And there's Maria is also it's Violetta, and Maria and Violetta in La Traviata. Maria and Violetta are the same in each one. So La Traviata is similar. The other is Puccini's La Boheme, one of the most performed operas ever. You had asked me in the list to also comment about if anybody of these listeners wanted to get into opera. That's the one that I recommend, the first opera for anyone that's interested in opera. It's about the length of a movie. One of the problems with opera is, Tristan and Isolde is bordering on 4 hours. So the opera in the video game is 15 minutes or so, and so that's a huge undertaking in time and effort. But La Boheme is pretty much like a movie with an intermission in the middle, and La Boheme is a little different. Rudolfo and Mimi they're in poverty, they're sick, they're suffering, so they're not like the two characters in the video game where they're royalty, but they are certainly emotional, and ends with at the end of La Boheme with the death of the heroine, but similar. Very, very, very similar in style. And when you listen to the music of all of those operas, they have a similar sound. So it's Uematsu. Am I saying his name correctly?
Yeah.
Uematsu. He is a schooled composer. I mean, he knows his background, and he's obviously studied opera, and he's able to blend opera and other styles into this game seamlessly. And I mean, I've only listened to it twice, but I want to go back and listen to it a third time, because it really. And I was interested how it weaves into the game, how the players have to pick a line from the Aria. I was reading about it online. So interested. I wish that was done more often, because that's what brings people in. It's hard to passively, get into opera, especially if you haven't, passively by saying just going in listening. If there are ways to interact with it, like the game does.
Indeed, I think interactive music, it's something that newer generations should get more and more exposed. I would like to, if you don't mind, take some points on what some of the composers you mentioned, right? You mentioned first Wagner, German composer, with a very strong and ominous kind of sounding orchestras in his operas. As part of the course, I had the opportunity also to visit the Nibelung Circle, for example, and I appreciate them. And I had the impression that Wagnerian music, it's slightly loud, but very direct. I would say in a comparison, maybe I'm completely wrong, but this is how I see it as a modern listener. I see Verdi more complete, more smooth, and Wagner more like hard rock, like more into your face with rich sound. I'm not saying that the Wagner is rough, but it's more direct to the face, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about it? The leitmotif style also keeps you always connected the characters with these melodies that get repeated, so you know what's going to happen in the end with a leitmotif.
Wagner was the king of that. He wasn't the first. Some of the early operas, Karl Maria von Weber, it was basically a German technique, but then it was used in Italian opera, French opera, and English opera, and now just about every film score uses leitmotifs to represent characters. But Wagner's somewhat difficult to approach, because of the fact that what Wagner saw in opera, he thought everything should be blended equally: the story, the scenery, the music, the singing, and he wanted it. His original thought was that it would never stop, that it would be like a play. When you go to a Shakespearean play, the acting and everything just goes on. He was actually rebelling against the style in the 19th century with opera, where they would, basically in the way Verdi does, you have a song and it stops and everybody claps. And then there's another song and it stops. And it got to the point where the opera audiences would chant for an encore. And sometimes they would have it, the person's hat would have to keep singing the encore like 5-10 times. And eventually in Europe, late in the 1800s, they banned encores. They said, you can't do that anymore. You can't be chanting for an encore. And now nobody does an encore. So if you kept, they'll eventually just go right back into the story. So Wagner he wanted it, he really wanted it to flow like a play. And in order to do that, he did integrate, as you mentioned, much more so than anybody else. Verdi and Puccini learned from opera, and they from Wagner, and they also did the same style of integration, but not to the extent that Wagner did. So. Yeah, Wagner. I mean, really, when you think here in the States, when I would teach courses to students about opera who were not musicians, I would ask them, "What's opera?" And they would say, "Someone with Viking horns on their head," and that's Wagner. That's the German mythology. So Wagner's influence on what we think about opera is immense.
I wanted to ask you about the second composer we mentioned here, which is Verdi, Giuseppe. And I need to say that, at least, again, when I think of myself as someone that was not listening, let's say, classical music a few years ago, many of these names like Wagner or maybe Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, they are easy to hear on the way. But me personally, I did not really know Verdi before. Maybe it's something of my culture where I come from, but it's not the first name that I would listen all the time. Nevertheless, it's, if not the most play or reproduced like opera composer, or among the most, his operas are all the time out there. So what would you tell the audience about Verdi? How would you define Giuseppe Verdi as a
Well,
composer?
Verdi and Wagner are both similar in that, and most of the times, the later opera composers are like this. The reason why Verdi's name would not be as common to anyone like Bach or Mozart is he mostly just composed opera. So he composed a couple of string quartets. Opera tends to be all encompassing of a composer. You see, Wagner started out composing symphonies and instrumental, but once he got into opera, it becomes I'm sure it's like the composers for the video games. They couldn't be writing a symphony at the same time, or something else. They're all involved in such a long project with so many parts to it that Verdi was really the king of opera. I mean, he lived into his 80s. He wrote some of his greatest operas in his late 70s. At 80, he wrote an opera. He just an incredible life. And I think with Verdi, his songs are a little more tuneful. You mentioned that in your intro about Verdi, and I think Verdi's operas tend to be a little bit easier for a non-opera goer to appreciate. They tend to have not as long scenes as in Wagner, where you really have to really concentrate to stick with what's going on. He also has some Aida, the opera that has been done as a musical, and as a play. That opera has a lot of instrumental music and big. The other thing about Verdi, big grandiose scenes with sometimes over 100 singers and actors on the stage. So Verdi is definitely he's not something that you would say, like you say, here's this piece by Verdi, but we know him more from his operas, and then there are some very famous pieces from that when you attend the opera every once in a while, if you see, for example, Rigoletto, there's some of the very famous sounding opera scenes that you've heard before, but you didn't know it was in an opera. You've just heard it on TV or radio or that type of thing. So. And I also add Puccini. So Puccini was the last great composer of opera until opera by the end of the 1920s, when talking movies were invented and that took over entertainment. Opera went from the major musical entertainment to just another one that fell far behind. Well, Puccini, he dies in the early 1920s, just before that happens, and his operas, Madame Butterfly, La Boheme, those they're very easy to understand and watch if you attend a performance. There's a couple of things, or if you watch it, for your listeners, if you want to check out, you can go to YouTube and put La Boheme into YouTube, and there's full productions. The Metropolitan Opera in New York. They have a wonderful streaming service. They charge us $7.99 for a month to view. But there's a trial and a student option. So there's a trial you can do for 30 days. The key with opera is you have to have the subtitles on the screen. If you go to the Metropolitan Opera or the Santa Fe Opera, if you go to a opera house, they typically have them right in front of you, and they're right on your seat, and you can actually touch about a half a dozen different languages. So that's real important to have. And the other thing about opera, because of the fact that there's so much of it is sung, and so much of it is these long pieces. Not so much in the video game opera, because it's fairly short and the story is fairly concise. But in an opera of a couple of hours, just like in a movie, there's a lot of subplots that are involved. So I always recommend, before you sit down to watch an opera, make sure you know the story. Do a Google search for La Boheme synopsis, and read what it's about. So, and then make sure you're looking at something that has the captions, so you can follow along in your language and keep track, because most of opera is in Italian or German. Italy's the reason why so much is Italian. Even people like George Frederick Handel, he composed Italian operas in England in the 1600s and early 1700s, because opera started in Italy. So most operas were composed in Italian, even if it wasn't in Italy. But then you mentioned Mozart. Mozart was one of the first to start writing operas in the native language of German. So then that started to change things. But that's really important when you're
I wanted
watching.
to reinforce this last point, because in my case, for example, I have been listening music and playing instruments since I was young, but actually what told me, hey, you should try to compose orchestral music, was actually a concert of Final Fantasy. I had the opportunity to have the presence of Nobuo Uematsu. He came from Japan to Buenos Aires, where I am from, and they did an orchestral concert for representing music from all the different games. And for me, it was extremely emotional. I need to say I cried, I think, in that concert. But why it was so emotional, why I was so connected with the music? Because I knew what it was about. I knew the story behind. And same way as in the course, I had the opportunity back then when we, for example, had Vivaldi for seasons, understanding the story behind, let me experience it differently. So for sure, I can totally recommend everyone, if you're going to go to watch an opera, read about it. Today we would say it's a spoiler, but it is not.
Right.
It is not. It's really it's an augmented version of the experience if you know what's going on. You mentioned also experiencing opera. There's the Met Opera cycle. Would you share this a bit with the audience?
Yes,
What it's about?
This is a wonderful. You want me to put give you the link here that you can share? I can put it into the chat here. Either in your notes or however. Basically, what the Met did, they started this back in 2010, and it is the Metropolitan Opera in New York. They got a huge grant, and what it was to have cameras come in on a Saturday matinee live and broadcast it around the world. And it started out small, and now each performance is close to 500,000 viewers all over the world. So you get a chance. And there was a student in the class that you're taking last semester, Emmy, who was a big opera fan. Yeah, he had loved opera, and he said to me, he said, "Tom, I hate to say it, it's better than being there live, because you're the way it works. Not every theater does this. You have to go to the link metopera.org season in cinemas, or just Google Met Live in Cinemas. It'll come right up. Then you click on a button which says find your theater in your country. Now they're not everywhere. I had a student in a part of Greece, and she couldn't find a one, but most students, I've had students in Japan. I mean, you said there's some in your area. Not every theater, obviously, opera's not as popular. But for me in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I have three that do offer it within about a 15 or 20 minute drive. And what you do is you basically pay for two movies, because operas, even La Boheme, which is 2.5 hours. One of the things about opera, the scene changes take way longer than they do in a play or a musical. So they a lot of times it'll be like a half hour. So there's a big long intermission. So it takes more than one movie. So whatever. For me, it's for a senior citizen that I am now, one movie is like $12. So I paid $24. And what you get is, as you walk in, you're going to get interviews at the beginning, the closed captions up on the screen, and you're hearing the sound in the theater, and the camera work is amazing. I mean, it's breathtaking. I mean, I've been to the Met several times, and a couple of times I bought the nosebleed seats with my opera glasses, and so far up. It sounded great up there, but if everything looked like ants way far away, and then to buy, to be right in the orchestra, you're talking about a $300 to $500 per seat cost at the Met, which is over my budget. So I can afford, my wife and I, for less than $50 to go to a movie, and it's free parking, and you can have some popcorn.
Probably close to home.
Yes, close to home. Highly recommend that. And then maybe not all of them. When you look at the season, pick a one that, like, there's a Mozart. There's always one by Mozart. There's always a Verdi opera. And there's always some newer operas, because they're trying to reach a new audience. Terence Blanchard's operas, when it premiered, had a huge amount of young people coming in, and people of color, and the Metropolitan Opera and other opera houses are trying to spread the word, and this is a great way to do it. I've turned on many of my friends and colleagues who said, opera's, it's too long, it's too hard to understand. And I said, come with me to one of these live in cinemas, because I think, now they're all hooked. They go often. And the other nice thing is, if you can't go on that Saturday, there's always an encore on Wednesday night. And then at the end of the season, all of those productions are on the Met's streaming service. So if you Google Metropolitan Opera streaming, it'll come up, and you can pick from all the operas. And I think it's $7.99 for a trial. The problem is you do have to give a credit card, but you can cancel it in 30 days. Now, I think it might be 2 weeks, something like that. But I've had a lot of students said, I was able to watch, a couple for free. And during COVID, they opened that up much more, but that does cost some money on the streaming side.
I wanted to mention one of the earlier topics. You said, like, hey, it would be interesting to read, because most of them are in German or in Italian, even though they were written maybe in England and other places of the world. Right. And I wanted to share for the fans the random fact that okay, the original theme was in Super Nintendo, which is like synthesizer sound, so there were no real lyrics there. And of course, the composer is Japanese, and the game in when it was released was in Japanese. But a few years in 1994, a few years later, they did an orchestral show of the game. And we need to understand that these days, video game music in concert, they are a thing. Almost in every country, you have bands playing this collection of music. But back then, it was not a thing. So it was a very special show. They recorded it. And even though it was a special edition and a unique recording in the 90s, the lyrics of Aria de Mezzo were sung in Italian. And again, we need to understand that this was mostly for a Japanese audience, and anyways, to respect more the traditions of opera, it was written in Italian, which is, I find, kind of cool. I need to share
Do
that.
they have the captions on the screen in the
I,
video
I
game?
I don't have any idea, but I will share with you, Tom, later that version because it's different to the one we are discussing today.